All right, YouTube. I wanted to sort of go into a new series or mini series or general theme of video making that I have sort of been focusing on political topics lately, just because, politics interest me anyway, but I realize that I've been sort of neglecting to make videos about the occult, about spirituality, theology, and so forth. So while I'll continue to make political videos, I also want to get into the occult, magic, mysticism, metaphysics, whatever term you wish to give these various phenomena. And I thought there'd be a good way to start it because I just got in the mail today a copy of the Simon Necronomicon, a contentious book, a contentious issue in which various groups of people claim that they have the final answer to what it's all about. I'd like to explain my own thoughts about this. I believe that I am at least mostly right in my, surmisings about this particular work. Which differs some from both those that actually use it as a literal grimoire, they take it quite literally, and those who are much more skeptical and they believe that the Necronomicon is simply a modern forgery. It's not based on anything ancient. It has no actual purpose or power, and it's essentially a joke grimoire that people, picked up at the secondhand store and dabbled around with it and thought it was cool and, had some nightmares and finally burned it in a campfire or something. To the topic of the Necronomicon, there are several groups of people that interpret the work differently. The first group, which seems to be the largest, are the skeptics. They believe that the Necronomicon is essentially a modern-day fabrication that the author Simon basically cooked it up out of his own imagination, either as a joke or to make money or something along those lines, that it has no actual basis in ancient lore, and that actually performing any of the rituals is going to result in absolutely no effect because it's not real occultism. The reason that I discard part of their beliefs, part of the skeptics' arguments, is that I haven't yet seen evidence, number one, that it actually is a fabrication. Now, I know that I'm simply just sort of ignoring the gravy train of people who want to come out against this work. I've seen no proof that it's legitimate, and I've seen no proof that it's a fabrication. So I can't actually derive any conclusion as to whether it's entirely possible that this author or someone close to them had access to much more ancient works. Also, within the skeptics' argument, and some of these individuals come from within the occult community, they argue that it simply uses certain ancient figures in an attempt to look, actually occult in nature, but that the rituals themselves are just sort of made up on the fly. It was written to look good, to sound good. Looking here, talking about the old gods and Lovecraft lore and so forth. It's got all of these little mini spells in it, preliminary purification invocation to recover potency, and it's got all sorts of different things. The great conjuration of all the powers. Preliminary invocation of the operation of calling of the spirits of the dead, and so forth. And it does borrow some of these terms from Lovecraft's lore. However, these same individuals that seem to be saying this often regard something like the Lesser Keys of Solomon as a genuine occult work. The Lesser Keys of Solomon purports, it is essentially like the Necronomicon when you think about it, even though people give it a high reputation and say, oh, well, of course it works. I called up demons. The Lesser Keys of Solomon purports to be an ancient text, as of the time of its authoring, based on actual ancient texts from Judea, from the ancient time, literally from Solomon, in the apocryphal manner, in some of these apocryphal texts, binding these various spirits to build the temple, driving out possessed spirits from possessed individuals and so forth. And it's actually a Renaissance era work. It comes from the 15 or 1600s from Europe. Does this mean that the work isn't based on an older work? No, it seems that it's based at least on those apocryphal writings. and scribes compiling that material along with various rituals that then would have been accepted in the Renaissance period. The Necronomicon is no different. On that token, I don't see how it's demonstrably different from a lot of these Renaissance-era grimoires that all point to some ancient text or ancient figure or ancient philosophical system or religion, and then purport to be actual grimoires. It's no different. And the thing is, people use those grimoires and they either see a real-world effect or they think they see a real-world effect. That's the second issue. I'm of the mind that the occult is not monolithic. A lot of people seem to believe there's one specific path they're trying to find that operates properly and the rest is all junk, or there's one philosophical system that works and the rest do not, or they work very weakly. I believe that any ritual system or ritual work or occult text or occult object can become genuinely occult simply because of a belief in it. A lot of people do believe that the Necronomicon is a legitimate occult work. Therefore, it is invested with a sort of psychological energy, and you can get into all sorts of weird stuff with this within metaphysics. You can get into quantum theory, the wave functions collapsing and so forth, and say, well, you know, it may not invoke an actual demon or entity, but it's invoking some sort of power, and therefore it can have an effect if you're in the right state of mind, and you sort of psychologically agree with its contents. As to those who believe that it is a legitimate grimoire, again, there's no evidence that the Necronomicon is literally based on ancient lore. Most people believe it's based more heavily on Lovecraft's work mixed with some ancient Sumerian influence that's been heavily transmogrified. Regardless of whether that's the case, it doesn't preclude the Necronomicon from actually working, if somebody is capable of making it work. However, looking at the Necronomicon and being fairly well versed in Sumerian mythology and so forth, it does have some parallels with it. I would like to believe that if you're calling upon some ancient pagan god that at one time in ancient times was venerated as very much real, that it could have some sort of real-world effect. As for Lovecraft's work, and Tolkien, and all of these other authors that sort of delve into the occult and have all these weird language systems and so forth, and talk about old gods and demiurges and all of these weird things, I believe that it is true that Lovecraft, Tolkien, and some of these other individuals were involved with the occult. I mean, I find it strange that if they weren't. Their material borrows heavily from a lot of, at least, archetypes from within what was then the goings-on in the occult world. I believe that Lovecraft did practice magic. And I can't prove this, but having read his works, I believe that it's probably true. He probably did see all of these weird dungeons and windowless landscapes and grim, horrible things in his mind when he was asleep. Maybe he was accessing some other dimension. Maybe he was on drugs. I don't know. Crowley. A lot of the modern-day occultists, a lot of people sort of worship Crowley and think everything that he did was great, and a lot of people discount his works as fantastic nonsense. Essentially, again, him trying to get attention, him trying to get money, him trying to be famous, or his own misunderstandings, or he was being misled by demons into fooling people as some sort of a joke on some occult cosmic realm. Possible, definitely so. However, the principles behind his work, specifically the idea that magic works and it doesn't really matter why, you just sort of go with it. These principles are legitimate simply because so many people believe that they are. I do not care whether the Necronomicon is actually of ancient origin, and whether the author and these other individuals actually found some ancient text from, Syria or Iraq or something like that and adapted it into a work. It doesn't really matter whether that's the case. It can be a genuine occult text nonetheless. A lot of the occultism that people practice now is directly inspired by people like Madame Blavatsky, who was exposed at the time, in many cases, as a charlatan, who was basically just practicing Victorian-era magic and conducting seances and reading her tarot cards and so forth, and was caught out many times directly misleading people as part of these rituals. That doesn't stop her work, the psychological manifestation of the things that she wrote and said, from being valid. The idea that simply being caught out as having manufactured something and pretended that it was ancient, or having manufactured something and misattributing your sources or something like that, the idea that that makes it illegitimate occultism, I don't personally agree with. Because then you would have to preclude the vast majority of all occult literature, which is based, stacked upon one another, essentially, based upon older works going all the way back to the Renaissance and before. And I choose not to do that. These works, these occult texts, and so forth, can work simply because a person believes that they'll work. Even more so if, like the Necronomicon or the Lesser Keys or whatever, they're calling upon pagan deities. Again, back to the Lesser Keys. One of the demons listed in the Ars Goetia is an Egyptian deity. It's not even a Judaist demon. It's Ammon-Ra from Egypt. And yet there are lots of people who claim that this work does project occult power. Yet it's a Renaissance-era text. It has nothing to do, most likely, with any of the actual life and times of Solomon, other than the apocryphal writings, which they seem to have been based upon. And yet there are people who claim that it works. It also throws in a bunch of Christian mysticism, like, calling on your guardian angel and so forth, which is dubious at best, but again, does it really matter if people are practicing these rituals? And to tell the truth, the Necronomicon is interesting. It's well written. You can say that much. It at least appears to be an occult text. There's also a going trend to say, well, it has to do with the movie Evil Dead. It's an adaptation of the Book of the Dead, the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, from those movies. The problem being, this book actually predates those movies by several years. The original, if you look in the front, and of course this isn't the first edition, this is the first Avon edition from 1980. The first Avon book's printing is 1980. Evil Dead was released in 1981. Now you can talk about the old beta tape that Raimi released several years before, but again, the first copyright is 77, and I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe it was 1978 or 79 that the original Within the Woods beta tape was released. So again, the idea that, and the original dealt with Native American lore within Raimi's work. It didn't have to do with an actual Book of the Dead. It had to do with finding an Indian dagger and desecrating their holy ground, and then people start getting possessed. The idea that it's based on the Evil Dead franchise, which I've heard from several people, is an interesting theory, except that it actually gets its chronology mixed up. Actually, this came before the Evil Dead franchise existed. No, I believe that the Necronomicon can be used for occult ritualism. The principle behind it being, first, there's no proof that it's actually a fabrication. There may be good, reason to believe that that's the case, but it hasn't been proved. Simon hasn't come out and said, oh yeah, it was a joke. Nobody has come forth with actual evidence that it was fabricated at all. They talk about, oh, well, people knew it was a joke at the time. It's entirely possible. If I had access to some arcane text from the 2nd century or something like that, and I was adapting it into a modern day work, I probably would tell anybody who discovered it before it was published that it was some sort of joke, so they wouldn't potentially steal the old text. Because it could be worth, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars if it's legitimate, especially to a private collector. So there's no proof that it's a fabrication, even though it's been surmised, and there is reason to believe it could be. But if you get into the psychological principle of magic, or the more secularized version of how to explain how the occult works, if you believe that it does, then it really shouldn't matter whether it's a fabrication or not, because simply by conducting those rituals, if you are in agreement with them, you can generate a real-world effect if your own psychology allows you to do so. The occult relies, I believe, upon a powerful psychology. And I would like to point out also, people that say, well, it's fabricated, therefore it can't work. It calls upon pagan deities, but it doesn't prescribe realistic rituals for calling on them. That's about the same as Christian prayer, and even Christian prayer is capable of generating a placebo effect and making people feel better about their lives and have a more positive outcome of their actions simply because they believe Jehovah's real. Even though the deity they worship comes from Judaism, dates again, just like the Necronomicon supposedly does, to Sumerian times in Babylon, and actually calls upon a deity who more likely was some sort of weird extraterrestrial or hallucination that also had a wife named Asherah, around which there was actually a cult for some time. So I don't see why people focus on this specific work and deride it, when you could just as easily apply all of the arguments made against the Necronomicon to the Lesser Keys of Solomon, or the Book of Abramelin the Mage, or any of these other Renaissance era or earlier or even later works, or any of the works of Blavatsky, anything within Theosophy, any of the works of Crowley, anything from the OTO, anything from modern day occultists. Much of that material is fabricated, or it's synthesized. It's actually synthesized from multiple backgrounds instead of just having Western occultism, which is Christianized demons that are being called upon usually with some sort of talisman, some sort of ritual that almost invariably involves drawing a circle on the ground and saying some sort of invocation and so forth. They fuse it with Hinduism or Vedic lore. They fuse it with Buddhist ideals. I've done this myself. I go into these things and I try to fuse together what seems to fit together, because I find it remarkable how many overlapping segments there are between different realms of the occult, the mystic, and even mainstream religion. They might borrow from any of a million different sources, but this does not render it on its own illegitimate occultism. Now, as to, well, does this mean Styx Hexenhammer is going to start calling on Dagon or something? Probably not. I'm going to read it again. I had this book years ago. Lost it somehow. I don't remember exactly where it went. Maybe it, flew back into the abyss or something through another dimension. I did have this book, and I read it several times before I lost it, so I wanted to read it again. I was able to pick it up for a fairly inexpensive price. Usually you're paying out $20-25 for it. I got it for $8, even though it's in perfect condition and it is the actual 1980 edition. The person selling it apparently didn't realize this, and they said, well, it's not the 1980 edition, but if they had actually looked in here, they would see it is. It's exactly the same as the book I used to have, which was the same edition that I got for $5, because that was back in the 90s when prices were lower and eBay didn't exist. And you could just go to your old books, rare book shop, and you could pick up all sorts of weird occult stuff. I saw, works of black arts and all sorts of, by Cavendish and all sorts of works there. Mostly introductory occult material, but it was there. Usually for $5 or $10, so it was pretty cool. It was way better than having to buy it online and pay shipping too. But this was inexpensive, and you might dabble with the rituals. I do more than dabble within my occultism, but you can dabble on the side with any work you want to. That's the glory of the occult. I don't believe in limiting myself to one specific philosophy or school or book or idea or a patron demon or angel or any of this stuff. I like to delve into it all because it interests me. So that's my thoughts on the Necronomicon. I'll probably do some more of these videos on individual works or figures within the occult, things like that. I've got a fairly large collection of occult works that I can derive material from, so I could make 100 videos on this topic and still not exhaust my material, and go into other subjects as well. But I thought I would get back online with the occult material, because politics is beginning to bore me, because it's not midterms yet, so until then, I need something else to talk about and become enraged over and start ranting on. So that's about all. Simon Necronomicon. The original '70s edition that's like hardcover is usually like $200-300. So I'm not shelling out that much for the same work when I can get it in paperback, and it's exactly the same thing. And it looks good too. I mean, look at it. It looks evil. It's supposed to, because it supposedly is. That's about all. Peace out.